Hi, welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. I really enjoyed this one. This is a conversation with Fiona Hill. Fiona is a colleague of mine at the Brookings Institution, where she's a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe. She'll be known to many of you for her testimony in the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump. She gave testimony in November 2019, and that was following her stint in the White House as deputy assistant to the president and the senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council. She's served two presidents before that and is a deep expert on Russia and especially on Europe. And we talk about her new book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And in that book, what she does, and in our conversation, we draw together what would standardly be thought of as geopolitical issues, international relations, strengthening democracy, and so on, with political economy issues, and in particular, the rise in inequality and the difficult transition from industrial and heavy industry areas to post-industrial ones. So her own upbringing, we start there actually with a discussion of the British education system. We're both Brit-Americans who've risen up the social class ladder, so we talk a bit about that. But then how she, in going to that was in the Soviet Union, saw real comparisons between the landscape in some of the cities in the Soviet Union and then in Russia was similar to her own upbringing in Bishop Auckland as they moved away from coal mining and heavy industry. And in more recent years has observed similar trends within the US. And so these different lenses that she brings to bear really connect together the difficulties that have been created by the transitions in our economies and how that has led to the fissures that are exploited by some politicians to create the populist tide we're living with now. I found some of the most interesting stuff, the differences between different kinds of authoritarian, in particular the very big differences between somebody like Trump, who is anti-state, and Putin, who owns the state, and so on. And so I find that very interesting. We end with a discussion of what needs to be done in terms of muscular political action, policy action to meet these challenges, and by extension to head off some of the challenges that we've seen from the populist brand of politician of recent years. So it's a real tour de force, I think, on her part to connect all these dots together. I hugely enjoyed the conversation, as you'll be able to tell, and hope you do too. Fiona Hill, thank you for joining me on Dialogues.
Oh, thanks, Richard.
I've been really looking forward to this. And I think I was thinking about the title of the podcast could be Two Brits Fix America, right? It's trying to guess. It's like, there's nothing Americans like better, as you know, than people who sound like us telling them what they're doing wrong. But
exactly.
but
no, thanks, mate.
Yeah, exactly. But they are doing it wrong. And but you're a US citizen now as well, right?
I am, yeah. I mean, I have been since 2002, so it's been a long while, actually. Yeah, coming up on 20 years, next year.
So you've been a US citizen for most of your adult life.
Exactly. Yeah, and I came here in 1989, so it's been even longer.
Yeah. Well, I became a US citizen in 2016, just in time to vote in the presidential election. Like literally the last day in Maryland, my home state, where you could become a citizen and still register to vote. And I was in the last ceremony of the day. So I was in the last batch of people. And it was great actually, because we're all from around the world. We all went and signed up to vote. So I voted in that. So I managed to, you probably did the same thing, because you've probably voted in the Brexit referendum and the presidential. I did.
Actually, I missed out on the Brexit referendum because I'd been away for so long. They instituted, which is probably just as well, actually. I mean, well, you've got to start asking yourself about how long could you really vote when you're not resident in a place. They instituted a sort of a cap after about 15 years, somewhere along the line. And as I've been out of the country since 1989, I haven't exactly been resident in the UK for quite some time.
So you missed the chance.
I missed. I could have. You've done this remarkable thing of voting in two really consequential. Both. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And obviously they both turned out great. So like I have a friend who's French, and he texted me and saying, "Well, for God's sake, don't take French citizenship because this rate."
What are you going to do next?
Exactly. Thanks a lot. So I want to go. Congratulations on your book, which obviously builds on your testimony and your time in the White House, but really is, I think, an interweaving of your own story of mobility, geographical and social, and the intersection of class and gender in particular, and then your study of post-industrialization in the three countries you know well now, UK, the US, and and the USSR. So I want to get to that. But let's go back for those handful of people that didn't see your testimony in the Trump impeachment trial, which we'll get to, or haven't read the book yet. Let's situate you a little bit back in the northeast of England, where I would know that's where you're from because of the way you sound. And we'll get into accents in a minute and why I sound the way I do. I grew up in Peterborough, but that's a long story. And situate yourself there in Bishop, what was it, Bishop Auckland? And in particular, there's this moment at 11 when you had this opportunity that you weren't able to take to go to a different school. And I think that sort of situates you and the educational system really well. So say, whatever you think is useful to that background, but situate yourself in the first 11, maybe the first 12 years of your life up to that kind of crucial moment.
Yeah, so I think an awful lot of my story is one about timing, as pretty much everybody's is, right? But actually, I'm born in 1965 in the UK, and it's one of those periods where the sort of socio-economic environment was very much in flux, and also the educational system. So you mentioned age 11. When I'm born in 65, the UK is embarking on it's more of an experiment at the time, but then it becomes the shift in policy, as these things are. There's obviously often a lot of attempts to see, how you can kind of change economic and other social and educational systems. And I'm born just at the time when the United Kingdom is experimenting with this thing called comprehensive school education. So previously, up until then, there's been either an academic or a vocational track in the education system. And you come along a little bit later, so it might be interesting to talk to you about what your experience of this was as well.
The 11 plus exam.
Yeah, so there's this exam, the 11 plus at age 11, that everybody in the country has the chance to take, no matter what their socioeconomic background is. And before I come along, the 11 plus sort of selects out kids, including from a working class background, who can then go on to grammar schools. Obviously, there's always this opportunity for people to go to private schools from, what's in the United States would be the upper middle class, or the very upper class in the UK, the professional classes, to pay for their education. But there is this grammar school system that takes from all of the schools around the country, sort of elementary schools, a handful of boys and girls to go off to separate boys and girls grammar schools. And it's usually only 2 to 3 kids out of their particular grade year. And so my parents, for example, both being born in the 1930s, they take the 11 plus. Well, actually, my dad doesn't even get to take it because he grows up in this mining village in the northeast of England, and he's sick. And his mother's sick on the day that they have the 11 plus, and nobody gives him a redo because the expectation is he's a kid of a coal miner. He's just going to go down the coal mine. So what's the point of having him redo the exam? It doesn't matter because he's even if he passed it, the likelihood of him going to grammar school from the kind of place that he was is very slim. His dad wants him to go down the mines, whatever. Let's not give this kid the chance again. My mum takes the 11 plus, but she's number 4 in the girls in her school. Very close to number 3, but she's number 4, and only 3 girls get the all expenses paid ticket to the grammar school, because the grammar schools are all paid for, every part of the education, including, there's bursaries and things for the uniforms and all the equipment and things like this. So my mum doesn't get to go to grammar school, even though she's obviously pretty bright. So she goes on to the other tier of schools, the secondary modern schools, and she leaves there at 16 and goes to train as a nurse. And actually, she's very happy with her career and her lot in life. Although if she'd gone to grammar school, who knows, maybe she'd have been a doctor or something like this. So she's already out of the running for, some other kinds of professions. And some of her and my father's cousins and other relatives who get through to the grammar school system, go on to be teachers. Some of them actually become lecturers in kind of in colleges and universities, and a couple go on to really much higher things. So you can see that this grammar school does create a different pathway, but it's kind of like you're taking out the cream of the crop, and everybody else goes off to more vocational kind of training at age 11, which is a pretty arbitrary kind of time frame.
The US has a history of tracking and so on, which has a mixed history, but tracking at 11. And you make the point that
it's very rigid.
Once you're on one of those tracks, it's pretty difficult to switch back and actually
to get back again.
My own experience, my father passed it, his brother didn't, and their relationship was never the same. And I've seen many, that's true for other families where, like, within a family you see one going down a different track to the other. because of what happens to them at the age of 11. And it's not that it's not relevant. And I'd like you to talk about how well you did on the 11 plus and what that meant for you. It's not that it obviously carries information, but it then overweights what happens to you for the next, forever.
The rest of your life, actually. Yeah. I mean, it's, I sort of joke to people, if they've read Harry Potter, it's like Harry Potter's sorting hat,
Yes.
kind of when he gets, but the Slytherin, the house that everybody doesn't want to be in is pretty different. It's like a whole life of, of difference. And as you said, when you talked about your father and his brother, families were split up over this. One kid would go to grammar school and the other wouldn't, and they'd actually often never see their family again because they'd be put off onto this totally different professional track, maybe academic track. They'd most likely move away from their local communities. It often contributed to the brain drain, and that becomes my story later on as well, for communities that could have done with a bit more of investment of intellectual capital or people coming in with qualifications to help think about how to turn the place around. So this comprehensive school system was intended to get rid of these divisions between sort of an academic and vocational track, people recognising that 11 plus was actually holding, the country as well as individuals back, because people are late bloomers, and it was kind of putting people on these arbitrary paths, and something ought to be done about it. So the comprehensive system is meant to keep everybody within the same school system, but you'd have academic tracks, like in American schools, and more vocational and training. But you'd have everybody from the same communities and neighbourhoods actually all studying together. And there were boys and girls too. So this was kind of co-ed schools, much more like the American public school system. So they start to phase out the 11 plus exam as I'm moving along in my elementary and education. And I'm actually the last in my cohort of kids in Bishop Auckland from the elementary schools to take the 11 plus. It phases out in different times in different places. So I take the 11 plus exam and I ace it. I mean, I'm top of my class, not just, my mom being in fourth place. And I'm actually, really highly ranked around the whole, region. And so I get this offer from a private school, because the grammar schools have phased out in my town. But private schools would look to offer scholarships to bright kids, boys and girls who ace the 11 plus in that final year. And the school offers, to waive all the fees and a scholarship, but it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover the uniforms. It doesn't cover, extracurricular activities. It doesn't cover the bus fare, because it's, about 10 miles away from my house. So I'd have to take a bus there because my parents don't have a car. And it doesn't cover, equipment and books. And my parents can't afford it. And even if there were bursaries and grants and, as my dad said, you could be a charity case, he was a bit embarrassed about that idea, I still might not be able to make it because my parents literally had no money, no disposable income whatsoever. So I don't go. And, I've often thought about that. I just go to the comprehensive school. The comprehensive school, which is actually next door to my house. Yes. And this particular comprehensive school, it's great, actually. I literally roll out of bed in the morning and, 5 minutes to go. The dream of every kid in school. I never have to get up and, trudge too far to get there. I can literally look out the back window of our bathroom and see the school and if people are going in. But that, is a very, obviously, incredibly different experience. And this particular comprehensive school is relatively new. Because it's an amalgamation of what was a vocational training school for kids who were probably going off into, car mechanics and all kinds of other things, and a secondary modern. And although the secondary modern had some academic tracks, it wasn't expecting to prepare people for university. And in theory, all comprehensive schools are also supposed to have what's called a sixth form that you and I are very familiar with, to prepare people to take their advanced level, A-level exams at the time, to then perhaps go to a university of some description, or that was even a bifurcated system, back in the 70s and 80s as well. And my school's just never had any experience of that, so they're sort of starting from scratch. Very different for the other schools in town, one of which had been the grammar school for the boys, which has turned into a comprehensive school. And for years, in the sort of school performance tables, just so much better than, the other schools in town.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, I mean, we could probably just talk about the experience of the UK education system for the whole podcast, which would be of interest to my handful of most
right, exactly. Everybody else is like, really? What's all this about?
What's these A-level things she keeps talking about? But I, so there are some parallels, and then I really want to push on how things may or may not have been different had you taken that path. Because so my mother, also a nurse, she comes from North Wales. And it was, if you wanted to leave, it was nurse or teacher. So she went to Birmingham to train to be a nurse, where she met my dad. My dad passed the 11 plus in Birmingham, was raised mostly by a single mum through his adolescence in Birmingham. First to go to university. He goes to university, ends up in manufacturing. And the one thing he said to us was, don't go into manufacturing, because he lost he was in management. So because he went to university, then he went to Ford on the management trainee track in Dagenham. Yeah. So he was in Dagenham,
which is the biggest Ford plant actually at one point. So certainly outside of the US, it was enormous.
For his background, and met my mum in his late teens. They married as soon as he finished university, and that gave them a different place to the one you had. But then, so I grew up in Peterborough, which is a new town, and my mum was the nurse at the former grammar school, which was the cathedral school in Peterborough, right? And because she was the nurse, even though we weren't in catchment for that school, we had the option to go to that school or the comprehensive school, which, like you, we live next door to. In fact, our back fence backed onto the school ground, so you
were even closer than me.
Yes, we just climbed the fence and ran up to the school. Huge, former secondary modern, huge school, new headmaster, very similar. I mean, I don't think it was quite the same, but it's good, early in the experiment and so on too, and all of the challenges that you have. And I then did go to Oxford, which you nearly did, and we had similar experiences there. But the thing that I wonder about when you read a story like yours, or like J.D. Vance or Tara Westover or people like that, is in some ways, you can read it as a story of a lack of opportunity, or you can read it as a story of an incredible amount of opportunity for the people who have the right stuff to succeed within this opportunity structure, right? So I don't know where you were on the 11 plus distribution, but here you've got coal miner and nurse's daughter in a poor part of the UK who aces the 11 plus, right? So there's clearly something about you. And then you didn't go to the private school. And again, I have similar family experiences there. You went to the comprehensive school. So that's an opportunity not taken. But you go from the comprehensive school to St. Andrews and then Harvard. And and then the White House. And so you have to wonder, weren't you just going to succeed anyway? I mean, would you have done that much better, Fiona, if you'd gone to the private school? Really, how much better would your life really have been? Or was it just like the Fiona-ness of you that was probably gonna, and I would say the same about myself, like with J.D. Vance, it was like at some point you have to wonder how much difference would it really have made to you, because that was a huge fork in the road for you at 11. I mean, that was a really much bigger than the difference I had.
I probably wouldn't have left the UK. Because I think, what would have happened in the private school, there would have been a lot of pressure, first of all, to, transform myself into a middle class Brit. So I have never been a middle class Brit. No. I mean,
you'd sound more like me. You'd sound more like me.
I'd sound more like you if I had, right?
Yes.
My only experience in the United Kingdom, all the way through until I leave, is as a working class Brit. And I still think of myself as working class, which I think for a lot of people is probably preposterous at this point. But that's, who I am, because I've not had any other experience in a UK context of anything other than blue collar working class. So middle class in the British sense rather than middle class in the American sense.
Well, which is upper middle
because
class.
I would have been, once I'd gone into that private school, and I saw that with friends who did go, because there were some other girls in the class who went, because they did well in the 11 plus as well. And they went to the private school. I really never saw them again. And when I did, their accents were all different. They sounded, as we would say, posh, but they had received pronunciation, or Oxford English, Oxbridge English, the Queen's English, BBC English, whatever you want to call it. And, they already were in a whole different world of these kind of rarefied team sports, debating societies, all kinds of things that were just, of course, it was team sports at the comprehensive, but they weren't the same. We didn't have a tennis team. We didn't have the kind of a high-end, field hockey team, and something like lacrosse. The kinds of things that you sort of see in private schools and things in the US and also in the UK. And so it was a different track. One of the people I'd been really close to at elementary school, and I lost track with later, she went off into industry. She I think she went off to YCI or something. I've totally lost track of them all, because immediately there was this rupture. They went off into a different world. And I do think I would have been propelled up much more quickly into a different kind of milieu in the United Kingdom. I probably, as I said, I would have been pushed to lose my accent, conform in many respects to different people's expectations. Whereas in the comprehensive school, I'm still there with everybody else. And the opportunity track is different. You had to kind of go out there and see things. Because I saw that when I got into elite universities, that the track opens up for you. I mean, often some people wondering what you're doing there on the track alongside them. And, what are you doing? How did you get here? You're not supposed to be in this, same track. If I'd come from a private school, when I got to university, people would have been, oh, yeah, okay, you went to Durham High Girls' School. Of course, but you go to Brit-American Comprehensive School and there's sort of this incredulity. What, how, this is not the pathway that people expect you to be on. And that in itself, that reaction to who I was and, kind of how I sounded and where I was from and the school I went to, really, I think propelled me to take a whole different course. Because it did get my back up when people were rude and, nasty about it. And I thought, well, I did just as well as you did on the 11 plus. In fact, maybe I did better because apparently I was nationally ranked according to my, elementary school teacher. So, I had every right to have this education under the current prevailing educational system in the UK. And yet I felt I didn't. I had this whole massive, not just imposter syndrome, but this kind of feeling and perception that I didn't belong. And that's within your own country. So that kind of made me sort of feel like I need to get out of here, which I hadn't felt like before. And I didn't mean get out of Bishop Auckland or St Andrews, kind of great education. I had a fabulous time on the whole there. But I relate in the book some in these episodes that made me think, wow, I'm being told by the larger society that I don't belong. So there's nothing for you here actually came from what my dad said to me in Bishop Auckland about there's no opportunity here. A bit like, your experience with the parents, you said your dad worked in Dagenham, but then he lost his job. I mean, everybody lost their job in Bishop Auckland. Even being a teacher and a nurse, yes, you might be able to get a good job, but the demand wasn't there because people are leaving because all the jobs have gone. And yeah, I'm also feeling that the larger society is saying there's nothing for you here either because you don't belong, you're not the right sort.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, and then you had that experience in Harvard as well, and actually you have a real go at the Oxford PPE people, and you have a particular go at Ed Balls, which I hugely enjoyed because Ed Balls, those who don't know, Labour politician, right? I mean, it's like Ed Balls, we've crossed paths a few times as well, but there is this moment where you hope you're escaping from the class system when you, to some extent, to the US, and that's true, of course, because in the US, so the accent that I've got now was partly sort of hammered into us growing up. My mother, in particular, as a native Welsh speaker, who then moved to England, was absolutely determined that we would speak. So everyone in, most of my friends dropped all their T's, etc. And so she threatened us with elocution lessons. We used to joke that they were going to be electrocution lessons. I'll never forget her face when I came home and used the word computer for the first time, but I said computer. And she looked at me, so okay. And then a term at Oxford, because I did wriggle through the experience that you described so well, again, through luck and happenstance. But then one term at Oxford, and I came home and it was not, and I wasn't speaking the same way as my classmates anyway, but the term at Oxford, go down the pub, and my friends are like, why are you talking like that? So you do get, so that sort of middle classification, or in the UK context, kind of happens to you at some point. So it would have happened to you at 11, but instead it happened to you at St Andrews and then a little bit at Harvard. So you pick up these cues of how to speak, how to dress, how to behave. At some point you sort of get acculturated into it. But for you had to almost escape the UK to sort of feel like how you sounded in particular wasn't going to be this kind of barrier to you. Is that
no,
fair?
that's absolutely true.
Otherwise, you might have been. You could have been a Labour MP, maybe, or a Conservative MP. I shouldn't assume.
Maybe, yeah. You never know what kind of track you'd be on. But I mean, you've described, the same thing there. That there is this sort of very strong societal pressure to be something and someone else. And what I initially liked about the United States was, in my naivety about what the United States was like, you could be anybody you wanted to be in the United States. All of these, social boxes that people put you in the UK were irrelevant, when you started somewhere new. I mean, look, I had relatives who went off to Australia, early on, just for the same reasons. They wanted a better life, but they also just didn't want to have people constantly questioning who they were and what right they had to be, doing certain things. Because, I talk in the book, and you've had that same thing, and we Brits still do it to each other, to some extent, where you're from.
Yeah.
And then they'd ask you, what did your dad do? And, what school did you go to? And that was just so ridiculous. I mean, nobody ever asked me what my mum did. My mum was a nurse, a midwife, and
I know. Actually, your mum was more of a breadwinner than your dad. It sounds
she was.
Like,
yeah, different parts. Yeah, I mean, we only managed to buy a house because of my mum's salary, and then she had to stop working. The classic case of women and childcare, and you can't keep working, and then we plunged into poverty. If my mum had been able to continue working, we wouldn't have been so impoverished as we were. We were way below the poverty line because my dad's salary after the mines, I mean, he made reasonably good money in the mines, and, said it was a sort of prestigious job, in many respects. People knew what a miner did. I mean, he really felt he'd lost everything when the mines closed down, status in society, his identity, all of his connections, family connections, his own village, kind of became just a dreadful place to live. But he ended up on the bottom rung of the economic ladder in the in the UK rather. I mean, similar to many people in the US as well. That hospital porters, cleaners, cooks in the hospital, grave diggers, council workers on the lower kind of level, manual workers, they were the lowest paid in the UK in the 70s, and into the 1980s.
And then you talk about the sort of squeezing on the public sector. But I want to talk about your dad for a bit before we move on to some of the bigger issues, because he is an interesting character to me, because he faced the challenge that a lot of men face in the sort of these post-industrial eras that you talk about, which is the loss of a particular kind of job, which is very strongly identified, probably with sort of traditional masculinity in some ways, probably reasonably well paid, particularly conditional on the level of education that you had. And the only way, and then they go. And it can't be replaced like by like. There is no way that with that level of education, you're going to get a job that's paying the same as you would have in industry, etc. And a lot of men struggle with that idea of trying to. Your dad became, and my dad's had these kind of moments of not so dramatic, but moments of having to kind of be downwardly mobile, if you like, as well. And it seems to me that's really interesting that some men are able to make that transition, painful though it is, for the sake of their family or whatever, and to sort of, to some extent, swallow their pride. I don't know if I'm saying that too strongly.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if is that fair? And how did that affect the way you thought about your parents and your dad and role models?
Well, my dad decided to kind of, in a way, I mean, he was a person with a really great sense of humour, and he was just one of these really resilient people. He'd had all kinds of things happen to him. He'd been born, at a time when his parents were homeless. I mean, they had nowhere to live, and they ended up living in a condemned building. And his older brother had to go and live with relatives, grandparents, aunts, kind of anybody who could just feed and clothe him. My dad was clearly not a planned baby, and he had all of these just really dreadful memories, but some good memories as well about growing up like that. He was 7 before his dad was in full-time work. And so his whole childhood was in this building that, kind of row houses that were later pulled down almost immediately afterwards. And it was, he was very well aware of, kind of why it was, the time, my granddad had been a union agitator for, improved working conditions. This was on the late 1920s and 1930s. And so he'd been blacklisted, so my dad was well aware of, why granddad didn't really have a job. And also because the mines were still privately owned and not so profitable. And it's really World War II that becomes this kind of big break for the family, as it's a massive international tragedy. World War II gets my granddad back in a job because they needed to make sure every miner was on the job, every skilled miner, to basically dig coal for the war effort. And, particularly, coming from Wales, how much of an influence even the whole group of Aneurin and Bevan brings, kind of men from middle class British backgrounds to kind of come and go down the coal mines to hew coal. It's the frontline workers. And my dad, then remembers that the war breaks out, granddad gets into work again because they need workers, irrespective of what they might have done in the past. And then they get a house. And they get it's a row house in, the village not too far away from the condemned building, but it's a house. And I mean, they get to live in there. And, they stay in that house, the whole time. And my dad's whole view is all shaped by, we have to have our own house, not just be dependent on rental thing that we may not be able to have. But, he realised that house involves, building something for the future. And he wants to make sure that we're never homeless and that we always have, something. So he starts to focus on having a house, and he'll do whatever it takes to make sure that we have a house. So, using my mum's savings, they put this down payment on a house. So Dad's determined that no matter what, he's going to have a job so that he can pay off the mortgage for this house. And the house becomes kind of the focal point for my dad. I mean, it's a real metaphor and, kind of a really meaningful thing here. He's always talking about the Englishman as his castle. He names the house, which is totally ridiculous, Hill House.
Oh, it had a name.
It's very small, I know, and it's on a hill, and it's his house. And he sort of fills it, with kind of the sort of memorabilia, of his life. And he just loves being in his house. And he listens to records, and he's always reading, because he felt that he'd missed out on this education. And he sort of fills the house with books, that he buys at jumble sales, at, thrift stores and, kind of estate sales. And he just sort of reads everything that he possibly can. And this house becomes the kind of, for him, this sort of symbol. And it's kind of his, retreat from everything. And he likes nothing more than just to come home and stick on a record or stick on the television and, watch matinees or watch the news and inform himself of what's going on around the world. And he just has this very positive attitude, because once he has the house and he's paying off the house, no matter how hard things is, he's already made some progress. So although he's been downwardly mobile in terms of his job, he's achieved something that had failed all of his other family members.
He'd been upwardly mobile in another way.
Exactly.
He'd actually moved to home ownership, which, as you point out, is a crucial part.
Becomes a really important issue
of wealth creation. Well, I thought that was super interesting and in a way quite inspiring. I do think how your parents behave in moments of difficulty, economic or personal and so on, does leave a real mark. Those of us who are lucky enough to have quite positive experiences of how our parents handle hardship of one kind or another, it definitely helps. So I want to pan out all the way now from your dad to global geopolitics and post-industrialization. I mean, because there's a brief version of your story, which you tell very well in the book at length, is working class background in Northeast, go to university, spend time in Moscow, Russian and history, go to Harvard, fortunate enough to be paid all the way through, which is important, right? That you didn't have
very important. And no debt either. No debt.
I mean, that's,
no debt.
That's, again, a sort of marker of like once you could breach the walls of opportunity, like good things lay on the other side. I refer to this guy's work a lot, but this guy, Joseph Fishkin, has written this book, Bottlenecks, which is like, if you get through that small space, right, there's this kind of space. If you can get through there, then good stuff can happen on the other side. It's not guaranteed, but it's almost like there's a whole world. And once you'd broken through, in your case, St. Andrews, and then survived all of some of the bullshit you had to deal with from the Cheltenham Ladies College people and stuff, which I think comes with upward mobility one way or the other. Then the world kind of did open up to you a little bit, and you saw these parallels between what you saw happening elsewhere, and then we have your trajectory up through public policy, Harvard, public policy, National Intelligence Council, Brookings, etc. But I want to focus on the way you do political economy, because you really came to see political economy as a hugely important part of the whole story. Like, it's not of how you think about global relations, how you think about international relations and so on, and particularly these post-industrialized areas. So talk a bit about how you came to believe that the economic trajectory of certain regions, and I think you do good comparisons, became so important politically, and actually therefore important geopolitically as well.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is, personal empiricism, right? It's kind of, what I observe and I make note of, particularly from my vantage point. And you would have had very similar vantage points to me. I mean, you and I have actually come from not that dissimilar backgrounds. So
well, I should say, I mean, Peterborough is a new town. It was growing. I don't want to overstate
the experience of, having, your mother as a native Welsh speaker, which very much discriminated against. My godparents were native Welsh speakers, also from Anglesey and Snowdonia, the slate mining areas.
And, I know, that's where my mum's from, Blind.
Yeah, and I mean,
they would get hit if they spoke Welsh.
They would get literally beaten at school. and that really made an impression on me. I thought, well, what's going on here? This is their native language. It's an older language than English in the British Isles, along with, Scots, Gaelic and Irish, and they're getting beaten, for speaking their language at home. What does it matter? So you even as a kid, I was asking myself these questions. I didn't understand why that was the case. These are lovely people who, my godparents, and, we lived next door to them. And, all of these early observations as a kid, I think a lot of child psychology and, research work shows that, kids do observe things very clearly. You get to see senses of justice and injustice early on. And so I'm in this environment, and I see this injustice on that level. And then as I sort of move on and I get to have this self-awareness about who I am, because people are always putting me in this box as I kind of move out of, my family and through the education system, I start to be more attuned to it elsewhere along the line. And so, when I moved to Russia in the first instance, that's why it's kind of this shock of realization that Russia is just a giant, big blue-collar country. Because, since the Russian Revolution and the, abolition of the aristocracy and the imposition of the Communist Party, everybody's been forced to conform, but in a very much a downwardly mobile way.
Everyone's working class, yeah.
Everyone's working class, at least in theory. And, in practice, actually, that is very true. I mean, there are, in George Orwell's Animal Farm, some working class people are, more working class than others, and others not, making a riff from that. But, when I get to the Soviet Union, because it's the Soviet Union there in Moscow, I'm studying at an institute. Again, this is another of these opportunities that was opened up to me, studying Russian at St Andrews. I get a British Council scholarship, so I'm on a scholarship with all kinds of kids from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, one of some of them are pretty aristocratic, actually, and others are kind of, some working class like me, Scots kids, Scottish kids. It's, kind of a little microcosm of British society. But the Russians are super interested in me because I'm the royalty of the working class, because I've come from a mining family from a very famous coal mining area. And they all know about it. And, so suddenly I'm thinking, God, this is really interesting. So I get invited out in ways that my other, fellow students are not. People kind of invite me out to see how other workers are doing things. And I see the social mobility that's possible in the Soviet Union then from, workers also getting ahead through education. Now, a lot of them are forced, of course, to join the Communist Party, but nobody seems to believe in it anyway. And this is also the end of the Soviet Union. 1987, when I get there, is when the post-industrial decline is happening there too, or one might say industrial decline, because they haven't moved past.
No, they're not at post yet.
They're not post yet, but they're about to be. They just haven't seen it yet. But already their industries are not competitive. Central planning is totally breaking down. There's lots of demand, but no supply whatsoever. And it actually looks like the northeast of England, where there's no demand because everyone's lost their jobs and has no money, and there's nothing in the shops as a result because nobody can afford anything. But in the Soviet Union, there's nothing in the shops because the supply isn't there. And I find this super interesting, because here are these parallels. The place looks like a giant northeast of England. There's still this amazing, culture of this being, the capital of the Soviet Union. There's the big military edifice, but you can see the whole thing crumbling in the same way. So I start to get really interested in this. And then this is where you see the political manifestation, because Mikhail Gorbachev, coming, from out of the Communist Party, and he is a protege of Yuri Andropov, who used to be the head of the Soviet-era KGB. And Andropov knows that the system is in really big trouble, and they need to do something. So Gorbachev, coming out of that understanding that the system's in trouble, starts messing about with it, because they're trying to fix the economy. And they think initially they can fix the economy without having to do anything much on the politics. And this is where you start to see the connections between the socio-economic problems and the political problems. So Gorbachev's policy of perestroika, which is well underway by the time I get there in 1987, is meant to open up the economy. And, the hope is that people will be self-reliant, that they're opening up for some entrepreneurship. You're gradually chipping away at the central planning. And they think that they can give people a little bit more pluralism in the system without, kind of massive political change. There's a little bit of a democratic experiment going on, but they don't realise how much it's interconnected with the economic situation. And so that once they start pulling at the strings, the whole thing starts to unravel. And it becomes very evident in the 1990s. because people start to associate the pluralism, the opening up, the democratization with state collapse on the one hand, and then with the lack of material benefit. So Gorbachev's trying to address all of the horrors of kind of the Soviet era. It's they're more talking about the Gulag. I mean, that's what happened to Khrushchev, but they've kind of rolled it back. The black spots in Soviet history, from everything from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and how they got into World War II, massacres of Poles at Katyn, just the massacres of Jews during World War II. Everybody's talking about everything because they kind of think that they'll just kind of address all of this, but they can keep the lid on it, and they can't, because once you open that up, everybody wants to talk about absolutely everything, including why the system doesn't work. And then in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union has literally fallen apart, and part of that is because of the political backlash to what Gorbachev was trying to do, and a bunch of reactionary counter-revolutionaries coming and trying to stop him, and then there's a whole load anyway of issues that precipitate the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's going to be 30 years, this December that it all fell apart in 1991.
Wow, that makes us feel old.
I know. It really does. I know exactly. But I'm sort of seeing this all happening in real time. But in the 1990s, you have political parties. You have, in theory, this whole democratic experiment really opening up. The Communist Party hasn't gone, but it's just one of many parties. The whole system is in flux. But the economy fails to rebound as soon as sort of communism and central planning disappears. And there's this whole period in the 1990s that people are familiar with shock therapy.
Yeah.
A lot of shock, no therapy. The whole idea of flicking a switch on the system doesn't work, because the whole of Russian economic history should have shown that you can't just turn this overnight. They'd never had private property. They didn't really have rule of law in the way that we expected, particularly in the economic sphere. So you get the emergence of this oligarchical class, people just kind of taking the assets away through privatization. And at the end of the 90s, people are just exhausted. They lost their places of work. Nobody paid their wages. Pensions are massively in arrears. The most horrific things that I saw in the 1990s was all people like my grandparents out on the streets in Moscow, with no food. Their pensions weren't being paid, begging. It was just a horrific experience.
Yes,
people, kind of getting their apartments taken away from them because, they privatize the apartments, but then, unscrupulous people come in and literally murder people, old ladies, to get them out or kick them out. They take their property. They don't know what to do with it. It's just the whole system. It was so complicated and complex, and people really didn't know what they were doing when they started to mess about with it. And so democracy gets a bad name as a result.
Yes, because people associated that with
the economic collapse. And so I see that because that's also how we felt in the northeast of England. We blamed Margaret Thatcher, and I've had a few people saying, "You're really hard on Margaret Thatcher in the book. She didn't cause all the problems." And
you are hard on her
because she we thought she was the architectress of our despair. I can't tell you the number of protest songs I sing about get rid of Margaret Thatcher. And then later I realised it wasn't really her fault. Yet we felt it was, because she was in her own way trying to grapple with this. So I was trying to kind of, convey how we felt in the moment about her, because you felt that she didn't quite understand what had happened, like the Russian reformers later on with shock therapy. Yeah. She thought she could transform things and turn, kind of working class miners into small business people and entrepreneurs and stakeholders in society, but didn't really kind of fully understand, what that would take.
What's interesting, so I think yes, you are hard on her. And I mean, actually, we remember when Thatcher was education secretary, she took free milk away from schools, and so
yes, Thatcher the milk snatcher, we said at school, and I really liked that free school milk.
Thatcher, milk snatcher, and so she had that all the way along, and Thatcher, out, etc. These were the sort of protests. Of course, what's interesting about it is it's similar, and you do draw all these parallels. Although I want to now see how we can separate them a little bit, because the sense something being done to you,
yes,
as opposed to something happening. And
right.
So there was this sense of like, this is not just like a difficult thing that we're all trying to get through together. There was a sort of deliberateness, at least it felt that way. And so
it did feel that way, yeah.
It felt like this is not Thatcher's trying to get the UK away from its, moribund industrial sector and move us. This was Thatcher's intentionally destroying the British working class. And you're right, of course, he wasn't intending to do it, but the shock wasn't as great as you get from collapsing a centrally planned economy.
Right.
But it was quite shocking. I mean, Thatcher was she's pretty. I mean, when you remember her own cabinet were turning against her. You don't mention the Falklands War, but that probably helped save her politically in '82. And so, but she was like the lady's not for turning. Yes, exactly. Right. It was this sense of like, unemployment going through the roof in '81, that brutal recession which affected so many people. And I wonder if that is the thing that's shared, is just that this is something that those people over there, whether it's London or the upper middle class or DC or the Moscow Politburo types, they're doing this to us. They're not listening to us. And it's more about the relationship between them and us.
There's a lot of that. And of course, that's how populism emerges out of that, because you get the them and us is, very easy to portray. But there's actually another area, now this gets back to the political economy again, where there are a lot of parallels. And you are having things done to you because, the whole goal of this economic change and these reforms is to wrench you out of one system into another. The north of England was dominated by state-owned enterprises, same as the Soviet Union. Because after World War II, there was the nationalisation of the coal industry, shipbuilding, steel industry, because it was impossible for the private owners to revive them after the war, because Britain had been cut off from the rest of international commerce. Of course, most of Europe had been too, let's face it. Right. But I mean, Britain had been under siege, in many respects, and it ended up having to go into sort of strange forms of autarky, and the private sector rebuilding. Look, we're in a similar sort of phase right now. We're all talking about industrial policy. Do we need this post-COVID, post-pandemic? We have these periods where it's very hard for the private sector kind of to do everything. And a lot of private owners had been devastated by the war. Understandably, they'd lost everything. And so the state had to step back in to rebuild. So there's the creation of British coal, British steel, British shipbuilding, etc., British rail. And so we
Thatcher
become...
Thatcher
privatises it, which is the same thing as shock therapy was intended to do in the mass privatisation of the Soviet Union. The only thing is the entire Soviet Union was nationalised, right? Right from the very beginning.
I mean,
it's a much bigger shock. But if you take, the northeast of England, the Midlands, all the places where the heavy industry used to be, Dagenham, kind of the, Ford might have been a bit different because the car, but there was also British Leland, and there was also some state intervention in the auto manufacturing in the UK as well, to prop it up, to help rebuild. You have this problem where you're doing the same thing. And so it is being done to you because you're being suddenly told, no, you all have to you have to moving really from what is a century, not really quite century, but elements of it, but a state-owned system to a totally private-owned system. And you're going to have to adapt, to something very different. There'll be different qualifications that'll be needed, as a process of modernisation, much less labour needed than before. And then there is a correlate in the United States that people probably don't think about, but I spotted it as soon as I got there. The huge, big manufacturing, they're privately owned in the United States, steel shipyards again as well, to some degree, but in the steel industry and the auto manufacturing industry, especially as it developed after, World War II, when it's kind of mass manufacturing, again under private owners, they also have elements of, kind of that sort of state ownership. And let me just explain why, because everything that the worker has, from healthcare, to all of the other opportunities, education, even, for the kids, is all tied to the big enterprise, the big manufacturing entity, because they dominate the towns and the cities.
Yes.
And healthcare is a really important element of this. And then your pension and all your benefits, they're tied all into this workplace. And, we know why in the United States that has developed. But people get tethered to their enterprises, just like they did in the Soviet Union, which is a kind of a weird thing to think about, because in the Soviet Union, everything revolves around the big factories.
So the factory in the United Kingdom,
it has its own health. But the big difference in the UK is that the government created the National Health Service separate from the workplace. Yeah. And so weirdly,
you didn't have all your eggs in the same basket.
You didn't have all your eggs in the same basket. But in the US, you actually did. And I noticed that right away, and I think that's weird. why is that? And then I start kind of, thinking about it, particularly as my parents are in the healthcare sector by this time. My dad's gone from heavy industry into the care economy. And so, I happen to just by, process of just personal experience know quite a lot about these things. So I start paying attention. And all my work in Russia is looking at the post-Soviet, post-industrial Russia and how the changes in the economic side, because I start working with our colleague at Brookings, Clifford Gaddy, who's now retired, and whose whole work is on the defence industrial economy. So I just start working with the economists because I understand right away that the economic changes are having political outcomes.
Right. And then it finds its ultimate expression in the rise of populism in the way that you describe in these different ways and in these different places, which relies on this, they're doing this to us.
That's right. And it's the elite, versus the people.
Correct. And that's the thing that's always true.
That's always there.
And now the elite economics is different and so on. And obviously you go into some great detail about your own experience working with Trump. And most of that I think you've covered very well kind of in the book and elsewhere. There's a couple of things that really interest me about it is your comparison, because obviously one of the reasons you came in to the White House again was because of your expertise on Putin in particular. And I found your comparison of Trump and Putin really interesting. And what I found most interesting about it wasn't so much the similarities, which I think people can see to some extent. We've talked a little bit about the populist wave they rode and the direct communication. Yeah. It was more the differences. And two things really stuck out to me was their attitude towards the state and what that therefore meant for their ability to wield power, and the extent to which they see themselves as unifiers or dividers. And I thought those two differences were really interesting. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about those two observations.
Well, I mean, those are really rooted in, some real distinct differences between the United States and Russia. And, in the book, I hope I'm not making, some substantive equivalency because, these are very different countries. Just like with the UK as well.
Right.
But I think, I've become a comparativist over time just because I've moved around so much and I've, started working on so many different topics. And I do think that, comparisons are useful for the differences, just as you're saying, as much as they are for the similarities. And as you rightly pointed out, there's two really telling differences. So first of all, Putin rose up to power in Russia through the back corridors of the state. He joins the KGB, and that's his ladder to social mobility, not the Communist Party. And interestingly, he's still not a member of a party, but it's the institutional pathway, the hierarchy, the training. And of course, that gives him a very special view on the world, which is pretty dark and full of nasty tricks and ruthlessness and, no holds barred, because he's a KGB operative who did all kinds of, nasty things early on in his career. But he also sees himself as a defender of the state. Because the KGB, their image is that...
Mr. Deep State. He's Mr. Deep State.
He is the ultimate Mr. Deep State. And they see themselves, as the sword and the shields of the state, the defenders of the state. So Putin is never going to rail against the state because he is the state, as you said. He's Mr. Deep State, and he's always going to rule through the state. And Putin hasn't dismantled the state. He kind of rules in parallel. He uses the state apparatus. 60% of the Russian, kind of working population are one way or another hired by the state. The state is, kind of for him, the be all and the end all. And he has, as I said, these parallel, groups, but they intersect with the state. He doesn't try to kind of kick everybody out. He basically, tries to use the state wherever he can. The other thing is, it gets this issue of division or unity. Putin's a historian, a self-taught historian. He likes to think of himself as a continuation of, everything going back to the Tsars all the way through the key Soviet leaders. He's Vladimir the Great. He makes no pretense about this. And, when you go into the Kremlin, into all these meeting rooms with him, I've been in this a couple of times. It's this white, kind of meeting room, and he's got statues of, the great imperial rulers of the past, one of which is Catherine the Great. So, he's got a sort of gender diversity there because it's, what's Catherine the Great? She's the German princess who comes, essentially takes over, and a bit Vladimir Putin-esque way through the kind of strange corridors of, the palaces at the time, unexpectedly becomes the empress. Bit of skullduggery, kind of going on there. And she, puts Russia on the map. And, she has these incredible conversations through letters with Voltaire and, lots of people, everybody knows who she is. She gathers Russian land. She annexes Crimea, which is something that Putin has redone again in 2014. Yes. Yeah, and she's known as a reformer, and there's all these things, but she also, indulged in a bit of repression. But, he's styling himself like one of the old imperial leaders. He sees himself as a continuity of leadership in Russia as well. And in each case, what has brought down the state in the past, because we talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union a little earlier, and of course there was the collapse of the Russian Empire. I mean, this is a state that's undergone two massive wrenching dislocations in the 20th century. 1917 revolution, bye-bye Russian Empire. 1991, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the erosion of the Eastern Bloc, the collapse of the Soviet Union, pulled apart by all these different forces. And Putin says, the kind of the great tragedy of the 20th century is the collapse of the states. And it all comes about by disunity, because everybody's fighting with each other. It's not just the economic collapse of, the Soviet central planning, the whole system, the exhaustion of it in the 1980s and 1990s, but it's because of the rise of nationalism, including Russian nationalism. This is a multinational state. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Armenians, Georgians, Azeris, that also helped to bring down the Russian Empire. Religious differences, political differences, everybody's fighting with each other, a bit like here in the United States right now. We look a lot like Russia of the 1900s and the 1990s, the kind of the bookends of Russian history in the 20th century, where every single group has lost their central identity with the state.
Yeah.
And so Vladimir Putin wants to be a unifier. Yeah, he'll go after Alexei Navalny and other opposition figures who are challenging him. And he'll go after LGBTQ Russians or anybody he thinks who doesn't really have a kind of a mass base of following. He can kind of pick them off, to kind of show to the others what nasty things could happen to you if you're kind of on the wrong side of his history. But, he would never try to pit people against each other in any major way, particularly any major societal groupings. He wants to have the maximal support that he possibly can. He uses the Orthodox Church for that, but he never baits anybody on the basis of, because there are other indigenous religions, Judaism, Islam. Islam is actually older than Russian Orthodoxy in Russian territory, and also Buddhism and also shamanism, but he goes after the shamans because he kind of figures that there's not too many of them around and they don't have a big base of support. But he would never pit religious groups against each other. And he's super careful on ethnic groups inside of Russia too, because Russia gave us the word pogrom.
And he doesn't want to reignite a pogrom.
He doesn't want to reignite that because they get out of hand. In each of the cases of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, there was a lot of inter-ethnic or inter-religious and inter-political strife, not less religious in the Soviet case, but certainly ethnic and political as well. So, very different from Trump, who sees his power,
he's the divider.
He's a divider, and he doesn't want to see the state. He wants to rule despite the state, and he, is essentially he hijacked the Republican Party, but he has no interest in the state.
Right, and therefore no interest in public policy, particularly, which is your observation of being close to him. And I do wonder if it's partly because of the way you describe Putin as having this view of Russia and of history sort of in a global sense. Whereas I think Trump's very, I'm thinking out loud about it, more parochial now. He's
very parochial.
When he's talking about making America great again, he's not really thinking about an American empire or America in the world stage. He's very much thinking about like within America. And so then if really you're just interested in domestic power or whatever he's interested in, then you drive the fissures, but rather than try and heal them. But it also means that, my reading of your book, is just what made Trump a terribly ineffective autocrat is because it's really difficult to be an autocrat without the state. You talk about Erdogan and people like that as well. They know how to use state power in a way that Trump, for the reasons you've identified, doesn't. And it seems to me like the state held against Trump, and the judiciary held, the government held, even January 6th, even Pence, in the end it held. And because he had no idea where the levels of power were, and didn't have any interest in playing him anyway, he just sort of bumbled around I'm not saying he didn't do any harm, don't get me wrong, but by and large, he didn't exercise power because he didn't know how to and he didn't want to. And the state basically just kind of contained him for 4 years and and God forbid that we'll test the fences again. But is that a fair characterization, do you think? Or am I being too optimistic there about how it held? Or because they took over, like Erdogan and Putin, they take the state, right? They use the state. Trump was sort of constrained by the state, broadly described.
Yeah, I mean, Erdogan is actually a similar, out from the state character. I mean, he rails against the deep state. Of course, it's a Turkish term, the deep state. But Erdogan did have his pathway to power, though, by being the mayor of Istanbul.
Yeah.
So he comes from a very hard scrabble background, but he was the mayor of Istanbul. Yeah. So he figured out how it all worked.
Mayor as well? Was Putin mayor?
Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg.
Okay,
but again,
they both got this sort of...
Yeah, they both got this kind of upward path through kind of state structures. Erdogan certainly has a chip on his shoulder about the state because, he gets prosecuted for a religious poem, during the whole period of, really stark secularization. He wants his revenge. But he wants to kind of basically model the state in his own image. He wants to de-secularize the state. And, basically, because he's very observant, religious, although he plays like Putin with this observancy, because Putin, also claims to be observant Russian Orthodox. And, I think both Putin and Erdogan see the power of religion that can be used. Now, Trump flirts a little bit with this, but nobody really takes him seriously as being a particularly religiously observant person. Yeah. And Trump sort of flirts with a lot of the things that they do, but as you're absolutely right, he doesn't know how to use the levers of the state. He wants to dismantle it, and he kind of, jumps on the bandwagon that's scoped out by Steve Bannon, who was an early, remains an advisor to him. And Steve Bannon has openly called himself Lenin, picking up on, the Russian image again. And basically wanting to usurp the state and then dismantle it. Because, of course, Lenin, that's his idea when he first comes in as the leader of the Bolsheviks, to dismantle the Tsarist state and create something else. And then they kind of realize as they go along this, oh, hang on, this isn't working. Immediate all kinds of disasters. They tried to start dismantle the state or mess about with it. Then all the Tsarist officials leave, and they suddenly realize they can't run the country. So they kind of try to bring it back again, and they create, all of these, basically committees, these emergency committees that end up being repressive mechanisms because they have to kind of force people back into work to do things. So, we're kind of on the bit of a verge of that kind of thing in the United States because Trump didn't see the point of the state. He doesn't see the point of the institution, doesn't know how any of them work. Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, lays that out very clearly when he does interviews with people in that transition period that, some of the people coming in with Trump, the political appointees from his campaign, not the detailees or the appointees from, the Republican conventional apparatus and people who've served in previous administrations, but others were just like, why do we need this? I don't know what this does. So it's almost like kind of the privatization of government and, but not working in parallel with the state. Can't we just run everything from, the desk here in the Oval Office as if this is kind of the air traffic control center or something, which is, the idea of Trump running his own family business. He just doesn't see why the country can't run in the same way.
And you describe how he essentially runs his White House that way. And so I think this is think about the future now and how optimistic or pessimistic you are looking forward, because I think if we say a dangerous version of Trump, and I think you say this, is someone who understands power and understands, first of all, you have to seize the state even before you think about dismantling it, and it's really hard to create crony capitalism without really understanding statecraft. And Trump just couldn't do any of that, and most people he brought in couldn't do it. Anyone who could didn't last very long. In terms of domestic policy, especially, it's a miracle you survived, and your resilience shows through. Maybe because Bishop Auckland was good training for the White House.
I think it was, honestly, yeah. I'm not I'm not an ideological person at all. I kind of went in there to do a job, which was figure out how to deal with the Russians, but I came out thinking, expletives, we are really in big trouble here. Everything that I'd seen in the Russian context and then some in other places as well, I was seeing here. And it's that kind of shock of realization that we're not exceptional. We are not, kind of somehow inured to or immune, to all of the same problems that you see in other places. we need to do something.
So we had so would it be fair to say that Trump had a lot of those instincts and operating styles and so on, but he didn't have the institutions for the reasons we just talked about, partly, whereas the institution. So what's your worst fear about how the next, because obviously the moment hasn't passed. I mean, it didn't.
We're still in it.
I mean, in some ways it feels worse rather than better post-Trump. And what do you think is the kind of bleakest picture that you can see for the next 10 years in the US context, given your comparative studies? And what's the most positive outcome? So, like, if you were to direct affairs,
I kind of feel, and in many respects, I've sort of said that we're sort of in that sort of 1990s period in Russia, under Yeltsin. Yeltsin's instincts were much more democratic and pluralistic. I mean, he knew that, and he had lots of technocrats around him. He knew they had to reform the system. And they had to reform it fast. That was the whole idea of shock therapy. So in a way now, Biden becomes kind of like the technocrats around, Yeltsin, who know they've got to pull something out really quick on infrastructure and spending bills. And, they've got to show people that they mean business and they can turn this around. And then, they can't. There's many periods in the 1990s under Yeltsin that the reformers burst forward and they come out with new reform plans and they just fail because they haven't got the wherewithal for collective action, and the task is so large, and people have become really impatient. But the difference here is that Yeltsin makes this fateful choice of Vladimir Putin as his successor, and he does that not because he thinks that Vladimir Putin's this kind of incredibly competent, kind of guy who's going to turn the country around, but he wants protection at that point because he's so unpopular and. People around him have availed themselves, let's just say, of some of the assets of the state. The kind of crony capitalism is already in the kind of a lot of the chaos really taken hold, absence of the rule of law, you name it. And he doesn't want to be prosecuted or persecuted for any of the things that he's done. And so he wants to choose his successor. And it's the successor, Vladimir Putin, that then avails himself of all of these constitutional and other kind of changes that Yeltsin's presided over to really consolidate and build and grow his power and to then sort of take over the state. And he's not at all like everybody expects. He's not somebody who they can just, manipulate and, push into certain positions and, push their agendas forward. He's somebody who actually is his own guy and he kind of seizes control of the Kremlin. Now, I worry about somebody doing that around Trump. They may have a lot of policies.
The next Trump, so the post-Trump person is like
even with Trump himself, kind of coming back in, that people around have seen the potential now, for really taking control and consolidating, their own power and their own agendas.
So in that case,
and Trump himself then also coming back in 2024 and really wanting vengeance on the state to kind of, basically more like Erdogan. Shape the state in his own image. So I mean, I haven't talked about Erdogan or anything like this in the book, but Turkey's been in my portfolio for years. I've done a lot of work at Brookings on Turkey, and I've seen up close what's happened there too. I've spent a lot of time in Turkey, and it was in my portfolio in the National Security Council. I worry about that because in all of these states, any opposition to this, and again, not on an ideological basis, but people who see what's happening, they cannot get themselves together. Because they have too many differences. I mean, we're seeing that now in our political system here in the United States. In the Republican Party, there's a lot of people opposed to this. There's a lot of, Republicans who don't want to be the party of Trump in the Congress, but they don't know what to do.
Probably, the clear majority, but it's like they couldn't organise themselves to stop him and probably won't be able to.
Because Trump is playing to a base. It's not 74 million people. I doubt really that all 74 million people, voted for this because, half the time they don't really know. But Trump is a very charismatic politician. He kind of eclipses everybody else in his ability to engage. Erdogan's very good at engaging too. So is Putin. He's worked at it a lot. I wouldn't have said he was the most engaging person you've ever met at the very beginning. But he's done all kinds of things from, these ridiculous guises that he gets up into. I talked about this in a book that Cliff Gaddy and I wrote. He's a bit like one of the childhood characters, the characters from childhood cartoons that you and I watch, Mr. Ben. A guy in a suit who goes into a magical costume store and comes out in all these different costumes and does these amazing, things. And that's what Putin does. He's ice hockey. He's the ultimate spy. He's a firefighter. He's a fighter pilot. He's this, he's that, the other. He's done all of that to be the political performer to engage people. So he's transformed himself from faceless KGB guy into something for everybody. Erdogan's, kind of done that, by appealing to, more devout Muslims, but also to others who thought initially he was going to be a reformer, that he was going to kind of, bring, get rid of corruption from, the previous Turkish regime that had totally lost the plot. That he might bring people together. A lot of people have jumped onto this. And I think people should not underestimate, Donald Trump's abilities as a retail politician. He knows how to connect with people. He knows how to get people riled up. And like Erdogan does, goes out there in these rallies and he knows how to pit people against each other so that they can't push back against what he's doing.
And I think Erdogan in some ways is a great comparison. I mean, you think, I actually had Mustafa Akyol on my podcast earlier,
right,
who've written a lot about this, and we've written a piece together about what Erdogan did with the Hagia Sophia, which was brilliant, to turn it back into a mosque, in terms of what signal that sent to his base. And so I do think there's, and of course he's gradually taking control of the judiciary and so on too. And so
that's right.
So in some ways, the model of a smarter and somewhat more incremental autocrat is one that kind of Trump could follow if he had someone of Bannon's skill, maybe, and ruthlessness kind of alongside him and various other people.
And others who want to be the heir apparent, right? I mean, they'll look and say, well, look, he's not going to live forever, although he might well. Look at Putin. I mean, he could be in power there for 36 years. So, people who wanted to maybe replace him have got a long bit of waiting. But Trump's made it clear that if it's not him, it's only somebody of his choosing, someone that he anoints. So there's a lot of people competing to be that, who again, may be able to avail themselves of the power that, Trump has essentially shown is possible to accrue. Because the US presidency has become more about the president, the executive, rather than the executive branch. And a lot of the fail-safes in the system, the guardrails, have been bumped into, damaged, or removed.
Yeah.
And, that's some of the... and participation in voting is starting to get rolled back as well. And we saw that in Russia. We've seen that in Turkey. And, we can see that in other settings as well. When you make it very difficult for others to mobilise against this, in Turkey, it's minority rule as well. I mean, there is more opposition to Erdogan than there is support for Erdogan. And same with Putin. But it's really hard to organise to get the kind of opposition, because everyone's fractured. Everyone's fractured and divided. Yeah.
If you're in the middle, I think that's right. So the fear is, who scares you the most? If it's not Trump, like who do you see people in the US? I mean, obviously,
I see an awful lot of people who are quite happy to, basically buy into the big lie that the election was stolen in 2020. Plenty of people have got their own agendas and they're very happy to pursue them at the expense of everybody else. Even if, they're probably telling themselves they're doing this for the sake of the country and many of these policies are great and there'd be, majority support in them. They're all about personal power.
Yes,
you're right. It's about them, and it's not about, this kind of larger sense of public service. I mean, I could name a lot of names, and I think a lot of people can think about it too. And it can be on both sides of the aisle too here. I mean, I'd like to kind of remind people that, one, you put tools in place, and you think, it's all right if my side have it. Well, what if your side doesn't? And a lot of this is in reaction to perceptions about what they think, different groups are doing to them. It's that polarization, that idea of sides. It's a big problem. And that in itself is a I think we completely agree about that, and that's. Biden said, we need to lower the temperature. We need to look each other in the eye. Yeah. I've done quite a bit of work on this whole idea of respect. I think that the loss of respect across political difference and other kinds of difference is possibly the most dangerous thing of all. But the last thing, I guess, is you've talked a bit about the incrementalism in, as we speak, the Dems desperately trying to get something done. You talk about a Marshall Plan for Middle America. You talk about socialized healthcare. So I'm not going to pin you to any of these particular policy issues, because I read it as you saying, look, there are real problems here being faced by lots of people, and unless there are big, muscular, proper responses from right-minded people, then populism and is the price you pay. And so, but it doesn't look right now, as we sit here, as if our political system, even when you've got some control from I'm not making a partisan point, just right-minded people. Yeah, right? No, exactly. Yeah,
Just, what are we going to get? Are we going to get enough? And does that, if it's breadcrumbs, Is that going to do enough? Is that? I mean, it's almost my bigger fear in a way.
No, it's my fear too, Richard. And I think we're both in the same place because I mean, look, we're Americans by choice. As I put it when I had to testify. We invested in this country. We put everything here. I mean, yes, this was a place of opportunity for us. Our families are here. Flipping the title of the book, there is something for me here, and I want to stay here. I think that's the case, for everybody I know, honestly. But right now we've got this gridlock at the top. I mean, we're proving to be ungovernable because people cannot step away from just their private, personal viewpoints. And, it's not just reaching out across the aisle, just reaching out to people outside, the political sphere as they would to their neighbours in their neighbourhood and their family members. We saw this in the UK, and I do talk about, the UK quite a bit in the book as another form of cautionary tale. We saw this with Brexit. People divided themselves between Brexiteers and Remainers. I mean, now that, Brexit is over, so to speak, it's hardly over, it's only beginning, but that time kind of animosity has faded a bit. But the idea that people are dividing themselves off into red and blue Americans, leaving the rest of us who don't see ourselves that way into some kind of strange limbo is a massive problem. So one of the things I, talk about in the book, is, okay, there's lots of ideas out there. The Marshall Plan, has been, ideas been put forward by many people. It's not necessarily, my idea. I mean, there were mayors from, the Midwest who wrote
you tell that story well.
A letter to the Washington Post asking for something like this. People are saying, come on, we've got to, basically have, as you think, some meta level, muscular approach to development here. This is a development as well as a political problem. But, if we can't get past the gridlock, then what? So I talk in the book about, okay, we can start to have some demonstration effect here as individuals with collective action. So actually in the book, I end up with a kind of a weird thing, I suppose, with this kind of book, which is what can you do to create opportunity?
Yes, if you're a CEO, if you're a college student, there's a to-do list.
And we could, join those things up as demonstration, in which to say, come on, we can do things, public-private activity. I mean, I'm also trying to put a challenge to, you, me, and our other colleagues at Brookings. We've got some great ideas there. Well, let's try to figure out how we could actually put some of these into action. Not that I'm saying that, the whole of Brookings should then start, kind of putting public works projects, but why can't we kind of team up, with groups and networks to try to help, move some of this along? A lot can be done at the state and local level. Despite the nationalisation of politics, we both live in Maryland, where we have a Republican governor, and we have Democratic senators. We have people who are pretty well respected. My local congressman is Jamie Raskin, who's right out there in the forefront of trying to protect democracy right now. We could show maybe a state or a local community level things where people can get things done. So how do we amplify that? And that's kind of the challenge to myself in writing this book. I'm like, okay, I saw how that worked at the community level back in the UK. There are still communities there. That was why I really am hard on Margaret Thatcher, because she said that the United Kingdom was a society where there were only individuals, not communities. The only way that things get done, and that's my life story, is through communities, people supporting each other.
Yes. And you talk about that.
Yeah, every single thing that happened to me was somebody helping me.
Uncles.
Right? It was a team effort.
Miners' associations. And also, I do think...
how do we scale that up is the kind of question. And I think we can do that. Instead of just waiting for the guys to do it from the top. Yes, we need those infusions of cash, but maybe we can find ways of doing it. Look at Alaska. Alaska has, on the basis of their assets from the oil and gas sector, they gave everybody basically a community payment. But Alaska, has developed ways of investing its assets. What have we got around? There's a guy called Mark Blythe at Brown University who wrote, with another colleague, this book called Angrynomics. And they have all kinds of ideas in there about how you could kind of create local assets, to sort of invest into projects that could take communities and other things forward. There's loads of ideas like that.
I agree. I think that's right. I think what I like about this is that you don't end necessarily with just a sort of list of public policy ideas that someone else has to go and implement. Although that's there's this guy, Jerry Cohen, who wrote this book with a wonderful title, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? And he has this great line in there where he says, social justice isn't just found in structures and institutions, it's found in the thick of everyday life. And I use that phrase a lot, in the thick of everyday life, because it's all too easy to say, like, well, that's got to be solved by I'll put the right sign in my yard, and then I'll vote for the right people and wait for socialized healthcare to come along. But in the meantime, I'm going to carry on with my own life. Right?
Yeah, I'm not going to do anything. Yeah,
I'm not going to do anything because this has to be so. And I think you say somewhere, I think this is where the macro and the micro, right? You need the micro for the macro. And I think they're absolutely connected because the micro creates the culture, and culture precedes politics, which precedes policy. As policy wonks, we tend to start at the policy end, right? But
and we're all waiting for some guy that we want in the White House. That was a guy, kind of to do everything. Well, they can't do everything. How can they possibly? No.
And they can't do everything unless our culture is accommodating of the sorts of things they're trying to do. And we create the culture in our own institutions, we have to stand in our own shoes, whether it's Brookings or the White House or your local scout group or your church or your high school or whatever. And so I love the to-do list at the end because I think that it's very easy, particularly with someone with your background and your expertise and your stellar career, if I can say that, to sort of be very macro, and this is what has to happen. And you do have that, but you also have look, what can you do right now in your community and in your institution? And I don't think that's instead of macro. I actually think it's a prerequisite for macro, and I don't think we're there yet, but hopefully we're.
Well, we could be, because I just see even in my community, people doing amazing things. There's all these great community organisations that are just helping people keep it together, but then they're also hoping to kind of, build them up again. It's all the community activities that give people a hand up, not a hand out, but a hand up. Getting them to housing, for example, people who've been homeless, because I think about that a lot after my dad's experience, from birth to 7 being homeless. Yeah. And, what it took to then have a home and then not having any furniture. And, our house, when my parents bought it, we didn't have the electricity on half the time. We didn't have any appliances in there. We had the house, and that was it was a bit of a shell, and we furnished it often with things that people gave us. And for example, I always, whenever I can, I take things to a wider circle, which is this great group.
Same.
Give them a plug, and kind of just thinking, because people are getting, kind of a leg up to getting a house after being homeless, to get themselves, also with your work clothes, a wider circle will help people, kind of get themselves, there's another organisation, Dressed for Success. Yeah. So, during COVID, we've all been on Zoom, so it doesn't really matter, so much about what we're wearing. But when we get out, the top half, we're all on shirts and blouses and things like that right now. But, it's all these practical things. And I realise, I know for a fact that that's kind of what helped me all the way along. My godparents, next door, the Welsh couple, John and Bessie Williams, John had gone to grammar school. He'd kind of broken the ceiling that my dad didn't have. And he'd gone from the slate mines of Snowdonia, to kind of into a management job. And, he then was working one of the local technical colleges. And they were, a couple of, rungs up the pay salary from us. They would always, kind of give us we didn't think of it as cast-offs, but, the first television we got was, kind of from them that we owned, and they would sort of help us out. And, people in our neighbourhood come and help my dad build things, and fix the house because they knew that we couldn't afford it. And, as people would just sort of pitch in. And people do that, kind of in my neighbourhood here. I live in an old established neighbourhood, and, neighbours pitch in. We definitely can do this. It's just we're not pitching in as a society overall. We're probably not going to get that fixed to the top, but maybe, kind of some of the rest of us in a high profile positions can show people we can do this. Yeah, one of the things that I want to do from the book is I want to use the money from the book to help, fund some things as well. I didn't write this book so I would, make money. It's a challenge to me, and it's a sort of like, what can I do with this, or what can we all do with it? Because people have helped me all the way along. I've got to pay it back and pay it forward, right?
Yeah, I love the way you end with this, because it gives us this wonderful scope. I should remind people that the book is called "There's Nothing for You Here: Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century." Please go and buy it. But there's this kind of phrase from the environmental movement, which is think global, act local, and you're the personification of that right now because of your sort of geopolitical background and seeing this sweep of kind of decades worth of history and political economy, and then ending by reminding everybody that what they do with their furniture and their clothes and their time and their political capital and their networks is ultimately what creates a society. Like, so back to your point about Thatcher. Like,
that's right.
And societies.
That's why I'm hard on her, because she was brilliant, and she broke the glass ceiling. She was clearly incredibly accomplished. She had a vision for Britain, but she didn't realise that it took a community.
No, and the Soviets really admired her for that reason, of course. I mean, that's one of the reasons why she
Iron Lady.
Well.
There was pictures. There were pictures of her everywhere when I
know you have that in your book.
This is so weird. I'm riding on this trolley bus. There's a picture of Margaret Thatcher every day staring at me.
She was like a bit of a heroine to the Marx. It's class.
I know, it was amazing, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was, but we have some of the same memories of that growing up. But anyway, look, I should let you go. Thanks again for your time, Fiona. Thanks for your work, for your both for on the book, but at Brookings, and thoroughly recommend the book to everybody. And I sense that we've got a lot more to talk about. But thanks for joining me today.
That's great, Rid.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.